Should I close the door?
You might have. So, welcome everyone. I'm Bob Rydell, Professor Emeritus of History and American Studies. My pleasure to welcome all of you here today for Sandy Swart's doctoral defense. This is the almost final hurdle to getting a doctoral degree. Sandy's asked for defense. We'll move in direction of making some revisions and then filing her dissertation, and then become Dr. Swart. So it's my pleasure to welcome all of you. Let me introduce the committee to you. I've had the honor to be chair, and the rest of the committee is with us in person and also virtually. Steve Jurassic, David Cherry, Kenny Arledge, Kenny, you're up there, and Brett Garrett. So Kenny piping in from Vienna, Brett piping in from NYU, Steve, David, and yours truly not piping in at all. I have right here. So order of procedure is pretty straightforward. Sandy will be giving about a 15-minute overview of her dissertation, which is a pretty remarkable ask, given how much time and effort goes in. So now here's 15 minutes to kind of summarize it for everybody. And then we'll open the floor to questions, not from Sandy's committee, but to those of you in attendance. And we'll run with those questions and Sandy's responses for about a half hour or so. Then we will take a short break, and Sandy will finish her defense with members of her committee. So with that, by way of a very short introduction, please join me in welcoming Sandy too. You have the floor.
All right, thank you, Dr. Rydell. So I just want to share too, this morning when I was getting ready, I thought, how great that I get to talk about something that I'm really passionate about. And usually when I'm in this room, I'm talking about federal regulations and what you can and can't buy on a grant, a federal grant, including alcohol. When I know that the bulk of the people in the audience are thinking, oh my God, get me out of here, I just want to go have beer. So I'm pretty excited to share with you what I've been working on for the last several years. This is a beautiful stained glass window that's in the Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank my committee. As Dr. Rydell said, he and David Cherry are co-chairs, and then Stephen Jurassic, Brett Garrett from NYU, and then Kenny Arledge. I think, Kenny, you're in Vienna, Austria, right? I think it's 5 o'clock there, and you're probably thinking, okay, time to go have a beer. So, other archivists and contributors that helped with my project, Diane Nee, Gardner Pearson, Ken and Deborah Swingley, Michael Lampin, Roxy Klingon-Smith, Suzanne Cohen, and Libby DeRosa. I just wanted to mention them. And then I wanted to give a big thanks to my family and my husband. So Craig is in the upper corner there with that fancy hat on after we went to church at Episcopal Church in Butte. And I'll show you one of the windows from that trip. My family, so that's Eli, Courtney, Ainsley, and Holland. And then my dear friend Sally, who's joining from the East Coast. She was my chauffeur, my international travel buddy and partner. We visited many of these churches. And then I'd also like to acknowledge the financial report that I received from the Ivan Doig Center and from the MSU College of Letters and Science. Okay, so if I were to show you this stained glass window, which is in Helena, Montana, what do you see? And I'll give you a little hint. It's called the Window of Moses, if that helps. But oftentimes I think we go to, we might have a wedding to go to or a funeral, and we see stained glass windows like this. But then what if I told you that it actually had an image of Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, the Liberty Bell, and the American flag? So as I hope this example points out, stained glass windows can be a mechanism through which abstract ideas can be communicated. And when church windows include those patriotic images, those themes conceivably can benefit from that association. So first I'll talk about why did I choose stained glass, how many churches did I visit, and what was my main argument for my dissertation. So as a stained glass artist, it was a natural progression for me. I began researching something that I was passionate about. And then in graduate school, Dr. Rydell had me come into his office, which was piled, full of books all the way to the ceiling. Said, Sandy, let me show you this window. And it was actually a memorial to Robert E. Lee in a church in Richmond, Virginia. And I will show you one of those windows in one of the next slides. But then in looking for information on that window, I became really interested in the topic, the windows, the artists, the churches that they were housed in. And then this led to an investigation of American civil religion. So as far as where did I go, I went to over 10 states. I visited over 40 churches. About half of them were in Montana. And then I actually went to Germany and to France to see an installation that was in Paris. And my friend Sally that I mentioned earlier was again my travel buddy for that adventure. And I forgot to mention that I went to 5 different archives across the United States. So what is the main argument of my dissertation? Well, I argue that select windows located in churches found throughout the United States represent a tangible manifestation of America's civil religion. It's actually a pretty simple argument, but hopefully I can convince you of that. And so to make my case, my presentation that follows, I'm going to give you a definition of what is civil religion. I'll follow up with a couple of concepts that contribute to that idea of civil religion, including sacralization and ancestor worship. And then I'll let you know kind of what were some of the things that I was looking for in those windows. I'll talk about 4 different windows, one in Pennsylvania, one in Washington, D.C., one in New York, and then I'll end with the window in Montana. And then I'll present the work of a few contemporary scholars. While I didn't find a lot of research, there was insufficient research connecting these stained glass windows to American civil religion. There were contemporary scholars who talked about civil religion, and I feel they support my argument. And then finally, I'll end with some concluding thoughts, as well as let you know why I think this work matters and why it's important. So first of all, what is civil religion? So most people that talk about civil religion or write about it quote Robert Bellah, who in 1967, right in the middle of the Vietnam War, really talked about how America's civil religion borrowed selectively from Christian religious traditions, but it adapted its own beliefs. So if you think inalienable rights, liberty, some of those things that we think are patriotic concepts, he argues are part of American civil religion. And they contain their own unique symbols and holidays. For example, July 4th, we have a huge ritual of celebration with fireworks and so forth. And that American civil religion also has its own set of relics and symbols. But that typically it's called upon or utilized by a community during a time of trial. So if you think of 9/11, we all became very patriotic and supportive of our country. And then Bellah also references Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in 1762 coined the phrase of civil religion and talked about how it had enhanced a moral and spiritual belief system, but that it also called on a sacred authority that would help unification of a community. So the 2 concepts that I want to talk about, sacralization and ancestor worship. So sociologist Francesca Montemaggi, she argues sacralization occurs when individual religious actors bestow value to the ideas and practices that they talk about, and that those ideas and practices then become recognized as legitimate parts of tradition. So this is the sacred aspect that's derived from the process. And that there's an attribution of values that can therefore shape the shared identity by codifying common values, customs, beliefs, and myths. And that sacralization thus refers to political ideologies, acquiring a religious dimension. So if you think of American independence, again with our celebration of July 4th, how we romanticize the American frontier, and then concepts about manifest destiny, that as a country we had divine intervention that helped with our imperialism and expansion into the West. And Montemaggi's point is that this sacralization is always constructed. And then as far as the concept of ancestor worship, So historian Raymond Habersky argues that American civil religion did what churches couldn't. It incorporated the myths of the nation's past with the promise of the nation's unique position in the present to create meaning out of a time of great distress. So if you think about the Pilgrims and the Puritans and images of founding fathers or ancestors that we might worship, they have often anchored American history to overarching narratives of religious freedom. However, ancestor worship and deification of characters like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln all but obliterated counter-narratives of enslavement and dispossession of those marginalized. So what did I look for when I was investigating these stained glass windows that I felt then depicted American civil religion? Well, I looked for the founding fathers, typical characters like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. I also looked for patriotic symbols like the Liberty Bell. I looked for the American flag, bald eagles. And then I also looked for rituals and holidays and sacred texts. So as a country, we revere our Declaration of Independence. It has a sacred nature to it. It's highly protected if you go visit it in Washington, D.C. I also looked for things like celebration of July 4th, the Constitution, Memorial Day, those types of things, and then also for ethics and moral codes that might relate to inalienable rights, liberty, religious freedom, etc. So before I start showing you the images, I wanted to share with you a warning that was rubber stamped on a lot of documents that I investigated at MIT and the Boston Library, thanks to the help from the College of Letters and Science. That the window images and historical descriptions may contain politically offensive language, depictions, and opinions from that time. So, for example, while the Pilgrims supposedly embraced religious freedom and tolerance, at least in their early years in Plymouth, eventually they too, along with other Puritans that followed, were intolerant of others. And their colonization often led to violent consequences that are not endorsed in bringing attention to these existing windows. However, these themes did influence my evolution in American civil religion, and they became themes for the chapters in my dissertation. So the time frame of when most of these windows were created and designed is between 1870 and 1950. And I bring attention to that because the images that they convey were from 100 to 200 years earlier, but it's easy to get it confused in your mind when you're looking at the images that they were created when George Washington was president. They weren't. They were created between 1870 and 1950. And if you think about that time frame, Reconstruction efforts were waning. It was a time of mass industrialization, innovation, and scientific advances in the country. There was class division, big labor disputes were erupting across the United States. We had massive immigration into the country, along with corruption, and the Gilded Age is kind of a derogatory term for that period of time. And then Darwinism was also introduced, and religious on a grand scale. And then the U.S. seemed to be in dire need of narratives of national history and identity during these times of trial. Okay, so the first example I want to talk about is from the George Washington Memorial Chapel in Valley Forge. So, as I mentioned, my friend Sally, she was my partner in crime. We decided that we were going to go to a church service in this particular chapel. And it was really interesting because we walked in, we were sitting towards the front of the church, and we could tell that service was about to start, and the rector started walking down the aisle, or some people would say the pastor or the priest. He got to the front pew and he stopped, and the whole congregation turned and put their hand on their heart and said the Pledge of Allegiance to a big American flag that was in the front. Then they began singing the national anthem instead of singing a religious biblical hymn. So it was really quite an experience. The color theme for this particular chapel is, again, very patriotic. The window program alternates between red and blue with the white limestone of the columns in between. So it goes red, white, and blue. And there are 13 sets of windows that represent the 13 initial colonies in America. Most of the sanctuary windows were installed between 1907 and 1909, some of them a little bit later between 1917 and 1921. And the artist is Nicola DeScenzo. And so I want to point out, first I'm going to talk about a window that's right here. So it's a huge window on this wall. And then secondly, I'll just talk about another window that's in this bell tower. So the first window is above the entrance to the chapel, as I just mentioned. And it reflects the life of George Washington from 1932 to 1797. And I argue this is a deification of George Washington as embraced by American civil religion. So the window is divided into three sections or columns. So this first column is referred to as Washington the Virginian. The middle set of windows is referred to Washington the Patriot, and that covers from 1755 to 1783. And then the final column here is referred to as Washington the American. So the key thing about this window, if you were looking at it, I mean, it's beautiful, but can you really see who actually is even in that window? And these windows were kind of hard to photograph because, for one thing, they're pretty far away. But it begins in this upper left-hand corner, and it reads like a newspaper column. So you would read the window down, then back up to the top, down again, then back up to the top. So just like you would a newspaper. And this upper left-hand corner is the baptism of George Washington. So this is a blown-up detail of that. And as you can see, here's the rector. And then this is a little baby George. He's being baptized. So the window in the bell tower is George Washington in prayer at Valley Forge, and this one too is by Nicola DeScenzo. And it depicts George Washington at Valley Forge during the cold winter of 1777-78, during the Revolutionary War. And what's interesting to me about this image is it shows George kneeling in prayer, which may be a myth. That's still up for debate. But it's reminiscent of Christ kneeling in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I think that was an intentional reference point for the artist and the church. Because surrounding the window, which you can't see from this image, is inscribed Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, like north, south, east, and west. And this image on the right-hand side here is from the Daughters of the American Revolution, who funded or sponsored this window. And then off to the left is the Washington family crest. And it's just really interesting because I think there's a lot of subliminal messages that this particular window can send. So the second window I want to bring to your attention is the American Statesman window. And it was designed in 1946. It's in the Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And this particular window was by artist William Burnham and then Joseph Reynolds. I put this slide in just so that you could see the scale of these windows and how difficult it is to kind of even hone in on some of the images. But also look at the light reflected from the stained glass windows on the other side of the cathedral. And I point that out because, as you can see, when I was visiting, it was pretty darn cloudy. But it's amazing how these windows refract the light, even if it's a cloudy day. So the American Statesman window, this has an image on the left-hand side of Thomas Jefferson, and then over on the right-hand side of James Madison. Of course, we know Thomas Jefferson is considered the author or the person to draft the Declaration of Independence. He also wrote the Virginia Bill of Religious Liberties, which kind of led to our country having a separation of church and state. And then also he was the founder of the University of Virginia, something that he was very proud of. And then James Madison, we know him as the architect of our current government system with its three branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. And again, I just want to acknowledge Diane Nee. She was the archivist that provided the information and pointed it out to me. And she gave me a very extensive tour of the Washington National Cathedral, including down in the crypts, and it was a fabulous experience. So as part of my dissertation, Steve Jarosik was very helpful and actually made some YouTube tutorials on how to use Adobe Illustrator, and they saved me. With his help, I was able to create these images or illustrations that show where things are contained in these windows to better highlight them. So as you can see, behind Thomas Jefferson is his name, and he also is holding the Declaration of Independence. Behind James Madison is his name. It is also inscribed with 1787, alluding to the time that the Constitution was drafted. And then there's a little Minuteman holding a rifle. Below Thomas Jefferson is the window that says religious liberty. And off to the right of that is a ritual in American civil religion of a president being inaugurated. And so I'll point these out to you now in a little bit bigger blow up of that window. So you can see here's the, Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence. James Madison is listed, the date 1787. The little Minuteman that would be easy to miss if you didn't have an illustration of where that actually was. Religious liberty and a small steepled church over here. And then this ritual of the president taking the oath of office. And I find it interesting, again, that this ritual, you can see the president has his hand on the Bible, and nowhere in our Constitution does it say that a president has to put his hand on the Bible and take the oath of office, or saying, God, I trust, or I have to look this up because I always forget the exact thing. Oh, so help me God. So when presidents put their hand and take the oath, they typically end with, so help me God. So the third window that I think illustrates the representation of American civil religion is by Stanley Warden, and it was created by the Keck Studio. Stanley was an artist in that particular studio, and it was designed in 1945. It's in St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church in Amsterdam, New York, and it has these central themes of war and peace. So this is Mary, and under Mary, she's considered the Queen of Peace. And this is Moses, again, he's considered a liberator. So there's so much going on in this window that I would show you how it's kind of organized into various hierarchical sections. So the top part, this is supposed to be God, so this represents the heavenly angels. The main part, the bigger characters, so this is Mary, in the middle is Christ, and then off to the right is Moses. But it also contains some minor biblical characters such as Esther over here and David over here. And then towards the middle, down by the feet of the main characters, are some Renaissance figures that are there to represent liberation. So Joan of Arc is depicted right here, and then Don Juan is depicted right here. And then this lower, on the lower 2/3 of it, represents independence in America. So this, off to the left here is the signing of the Magna Carta. And then off to the right, that's balanced with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And then you almost can't see it, but there's a little Liberty Bell right here. And they're ringing the Liberty Bell. And then at the bottom, of course, are various branches of the military in America, along with a representation of America's Great Seal with the bald eagle. So this window was so busy that it was a very detailed Adobe Illustrator illustration that I had to make. And in the stained glass world, stained glass artists would call this a cartoon that they would use as a design template for their window. But I also had to create a table to kind of explain what a lot of these images were. And the last window that I wanted to talk about is in Butte, Montana. So this is the Ashworth Memorial window. It was designed and installed in the 1940s. It's in St. Paul's Episcopal Church. This church was probably the hardest church for me to get into. I tried month after month and made several phone calls, but they were going through a transition in their leadership. And it was created by the J&R Lamb Studio, and that studio is one of the oldest consecutively running studios in the United States and is still in existence today. So this window, that kind of looks like a totem pole, has a lot going on. And I'm only going to point out a few of these numbers in here because Bob told me I only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to try and go quick here. Number 2, so that's right here, those are the Naval Aviation Wings. And Thomas Ashworth, that this is a memorial to, was actually the son of the rector of this church. And he was an aviator, and he died trying to land his plane on an aircraft carrier in the war. So they designed this window with all of these naval themes incorporated into the window. The central figure, number 5, I found a drawing from the artist that referred to this as the winged figure of aspiration for sacrifice. In other words, the ultimate sacrifice is to give your life for your country. Then number 7 here, this is the Great Seal of the United States. Number 9, which looks a lot like the Great Seal, is actually the Navy emblem. And then number 10 down here, that's kind of in the golden brown, that represents an anchor cross, which is another theme that ties in with the naval military component of this window. And then number 11 is a warship, which is right here. And then number 12 is Noah's Ark. So let me show you a little bit closer picture of this bottom portion of this window. So as you can see, it refers to Abraham Lincoln's comment in the Gettysburg Address, the last full measure of devotion is to give one's life for their country, and he was talking about the Civil War. And you can see that this is actually a warship, not an aircraft carrier, so I don't know if that was a mistake that the artist made and didn't realize that he died trying to land his plane on the aircraft carrier. But the whole thing has these naval symbolisms, such as the flying fish. But then as you can see down here, it also ties in the Christian religious aspect of this. This is Noah, this is the ark, and he's sending forth the little dove. So I mentioned that there was insufficient research into this whole topic connecting stained glass windows to American civil religion. However, there are current scholars I feel their work indirectly supports my argument of civil religion as found in these images. So William Trutner is the Smithsonian curator and art historian, and he notes that works of art have a special advantage in supporting ideological arguments. They rarely openly advance, for example, territorial expansion or the disposition of native races and native land. Rather, they turn back the clock and they present their arguments as part of a distant past, gaining time-honored legitimacy. And then Michael Kamen, who's a Cornell historian, says that history in general became the core of civil religion in our country during the spiritual crisis of the Gilded Age. And that reflects how many Americans remember selectively about our American history. And then Yale historian David Blight argues that the deepest cultural myths transcend generations and are mechanisms of historical memory, but they can also be used as cultural weapons. So why I feel my work is important? Well, it highlights that one of those cultural weapons could be embodied in American civil religion's stained glass windows. These windows reflect a national tendency to mask less desirable aspects of history. And to borrow from Dr. Rydell, that's a whitewashing, that's his term, that certain political activities with civil religion are depicted and romanticized in these windows. And the windows provide insight into America's civil religion and its ancestor worship. They help us understand the complexity of our past and provide a historical narrative regarding the political and cultural influences of that time. So indeed, the windows help inform current issues. This window actually was at the Boston University when I was doing my archival work at MIT. The artifacts reflect the evolving phenomenon of civil religion in the United States. The images are so deftly woven into larger biblical tapestries. If you think of Mary, Christ and Moses, and below that tiny little Liberty Bell, that means that little, if any, scholarly attention has been directed towards this manifestation of civil religion. And many of the windows need restoration and are simply being discarded and are therefore disappearing. And so the next slide shows an example of that. So thank you, Sally. She's Vanna White in this picture, pointing out that this window directly across the aisle from the Liberty window that I showed you is in dire need of restoration. This is an actual functioning window, which means if the snow is blowing hard, it's going to make it through these cracks. But to restore the windows typically costs almost as much as it would cost to recreate the windows. So what are some of the potential gaps that I identified? Obviously, more comprehensive investigation is needed into this topic. I only scratched the surface. Many of the archival documents, I was lucky at St. Peter's Church in Helena, they had a very well-organized library that I was able to find some archival documents. But the evolution of a Windows design is often depicted in those documents and helps inform why those patriotic elements may have been incorporated into the windows, but many churches are finding that they can't keep them and they end up just throwing them away. And removal of memorial windows and their potential disposition is timely, but it was beyond the scope of my project. While I did touch on it in my dissertation, my hope is that my research contributes to and helps inform those really important discussions. And I agree with historian David Blight, who argues that removal of similar monuments and artifacts does indeed benefit from thoughtful consideration and discussion. The decommissioning of controversial and offensive windows, which actually has already started to happen in the Washington National Cathedral. They removed a whole bay of windows that had Confederate flag imagery in the windows. So when they are decommissioned, any future display of those artifacts, for example, if they're headed to the Smithsonian, should be carefully curated. So now, in case you're still wondering about the first window that I kind of teased you with, I just wanted to point out that the main figure is Moses, as I hinted at, and truly he's holding the 10 Commandments, not a baby, as one of my family members thought. And then the Liberty Bell, you can see I blew up the picture over here, is to the side of Abraham, and then this is the American flag. If I recall correctly, this is the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, represents that. And then down at the bottom, kind of anchoring the window, is George Washington and Abraham Lincoln kneeling in prayer, flanking a Bible that says, "I will walk among you and will be your God, and you shall be my people." So I can't believe I got through that. I don't know if I did it. I don't think I did it in 15 minutes. I'm sorry, Bob. But I had a lot of family and friends who were incredibly supportive of me through this process. And so I feel truly very blessed that they were as supportive as they were. And then, that's another image of a window that was a gift to somebody, and I wanted to point out my references. But then while I took questions, I thought I would show a video that I took in Richmond, Virginia. So this is actually the church that Dr. Rydell told me about. It's St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond. And this window on the left is the upper memorial window to Robert E. Lee, which is a companion of the lower window that Dr. Rydell showed me. And it's older Moses looking up into heaven. And the window was designed by Henry Holliday. Then off to the right is another window that was created by Louis Comfort Tiffany. And again, it was kind of a cloudy day when I was there, but I like how the light kind of dapples through these windows and almost animates the figures that are represented there. So I'll run the video and answer any questions. So thank you for your time. So can you see, it goes kind of back and forth between the two windows. Starts more with a Henry Holliday window, and then it transitions over to the Louis Comfort Tiffany window, and the wings of the angel look like she's almost flying, which I think is fascinating. And that's another avenue that Steve was saying would be really interesting to pursue in this work, as far as that interaction between the light and the stained glass window. Allison.
So thank you, Sandy, because I do love stained glass, but I honestly have never noticed a civil religion symbol ever in stained glass, so you've given me something to really look for. But tell us what's your favorite piece that you've seen, and why is it your favorite?
So my favorite piece, actually, it kind of ties into my work, but I don't talk about it in my dissertation, and I didn't use it as an example. It's a Rowan Lecomte window that's in the Washington National Cathedral, and it actually contains a piece of moon rock that they were able to get from the government. And it's this beautiful window that represents the beginning of life and so forth. And it's pretty abstract, but I just kind of like the symbolism of it and what it represents. So that would be a hard question, because there were a lot of really fabulous windows. And the archivists were so gracious with their time. The one at Grace Cathedral, which I also don't talk about in my dissertation, took me up into the catwalk. And he said, it's a good thing that you aren't afraid of heights because we were way up in the cathedral. And then he took me outside where so I could see the windows from the outside and get the scale of the windows. I really have had some fabulous adventures in this. And those windows, they had a Einstein window that said E equals MC squared. There's also a window in the Helena Cathedral that people don't realize is there, the Catholic Cathedral. And it's Christopher Columbus meeting some Native Americans. And I think most people feel that that's an image from the Bible. So it's been a really interesting adventure, to be sure. Great.
So I'm interested in some of the steps before a window is made. Does the church or the civic leaders say we'd like this window to have these sort of elements, and they give guidance to the artists? Does the artist know kind of what they need to do and therefore fulfill those requests, or is the artist driving a lot of this? How does that design stage develop?
So it's a very organic process typically. And back when these windows were made, a lot of it went through the mail because people didn't have telephones and so forth. So those documents that I found in some of the archives would have a preliminary idea. For example, they wanted to give a memorial to a church in Helena to Bishop Tuttle, who came and started some of the churches in Montana. And so they said, we want an image of Bishop Tuttle. We want it to represent the frontier. So the sponsor would talk to the vestry and the minister of the church, who would then work with the artists that typically they were on the East Coast. And so this back and forth about, what we want it to be in these jewel tones of blue. The beard of Bishop Tuttle isn't, ragged enough because he was on the frontier. It looks like a priest from the East Coast. So those types of evolutions in the design would be documented in those archival documents. And typically what I found is that they would scratch out, quote this Bible verse, and substitute it with this one. Or it would say they decided that they don't want pine trees to represent the frontier, they want log cabins. So that would all be kind of scratched out and written on the side. So truly it was mostly an evolution and a very organic process that happened typically between three characters: the sponsor of the window, usually it's somebody that wanted to memorialize one of their relatives, the vestry and the church minister, and then the artist. And sometimes the architect was involved. It's a great question though. So, and then what would happen in creating these stained glass windows, they would draft up a rough sketch of what it would look like. And then they would do a color, like a watercolor piece of art that they would send to the church and the sponsor to look at. They would modify that. From that smaller image or a piece of art, then they would blow it up into the large size cartoon. And I was able to find some of those full size cartoons in the Onondaga Historical Society in New York, which was really interesting. But so they would have these life-sized cartoons, which then in the stained glass studios, there's typically somebody who cuts the glass, somebody that blows up the cartoons, somebody that glazes the window or puts the, leads it and puts the putty in it. And there's also kind of an intermediate process where they put wax on the glass and put it on an actual window so they can see if the colors are what the artist wants to be depicted in the window. So it has a lot of steps in it. And I think it's one of the reasons why windows are still very expensive today, because that process hasn't really changed throughout the centuries. I mean, they used to cut the glass with a heated point, and now we cut it with a diamond glass cutter. But truly, it's a difficult art for craftsmen to create. So thanks for your question. That's probably more than you wanted to hear, but. Anybody else?
So did you have the Robert E. Lee window? Do you have an image of that? That you can find quickly?
I think if I would have it on here, I'm not sure. don't think I do. So, but I can explain it. So it's directly below this window. So this is an older Moses, and the window that Dr. Rydell initially showed me was a younger Moses leaving the house of Pharaoh. And what the intent was behind this window is that many of the people from St. Paul's Cathedral felt they wanted to venerate Robert E. Lee. And so Moses, when he left the house of Pharaoh, was conflicted because he saw all of the slaves, and he really didn't feel like he should have this privileged life in the house of Pharaoh. So he ended up leaving the house of Pharaoh and, guiding the Israelites to the promised land. So as many people know, Robert E. Lee was offered to lead a northern military unit or become a general for the North, and he didn't. He decided that he was from Virginia, and so he ended up being one of the leaders of the Confederate Army. So it's a indirect link as far as Moses leaving the house of Pharaoh and Lee taking his commission for the Confederacy. And he's in the image, this younger Moses is throwing down the staff of office. So, I mean, it's the colors are very similar to this, and I do have a lot of pictures of them, but not on this particular phone drive. So, which I have to give Kenny some thanks for. He kind of helped me organize my pictures, and I say I have hundreds of photographs, but I think I actually have thousands. So I ended up taking my camera, my phone, and a backup, disc because my technology would run out of battery, and I would have to switch over and start taking pictures with something else. So it's kind of fun. Liz,
I have a question for you. Firstly, this is so interesting, and I know you're trying to situate your work with what other people said, but my sense is that you've made a discovery. So I really hope you take this, further in your publication or talking about this so that other people can learn at the site. So that's in this room. It's super interesting. So here's my question. I mean, I think, is it true that, murals in churches and stained glass, they tell a story, and particularly like Heather, origins, because this is when people couldn't read, it is how people, how they got a story, and it was a way to communicate, but also to shape identity. And so I think, what's so interesting in this is this idea of American identity through this American civil religion. So I'm curious about what you found in Paris. Is this I don't think it is, but it's not an American phenomenon, right? But this must happen all over the place, and we don't even see it with kings or royalty. And what did you discover in Paris? And were there American things in Paris? And how do you think that this phenomena occurs in other places?
So in looking at certainly medieval stained glass work and the Gothic cathedrals across Europe and in France, they, you're correct, truly were creating these visual stories for people who couldn't read. Then once people began to read and the merchant class started rising in the communities, the windows shifted a little bit as far as they became sponsors of some of the windows. Instead of these huge cathedrals, they started building more quaint chapels in those particular smaller communities. So there's a similarity a little bit there as far as how sometimes these patrons of the windows that are in the merchant class would do a memorial window, and they would put their child's face on an angel's face in a biblical scene. So a little similar. But the church that I wanted to see in Paris was called the American Church in Paris. And I had read about a window there that was called the Ally window, and it had an image of George Washington standing next to Lafayette. And it was interesting because it incorporated a lot of the civil religion. It had characters of William Penn, and I think Abraham Lincoln. But then it also kind of compared our collaboration with the French as an ally during the American Revolution, and the idea of independence. So it had the falling of the Bastille and the ringing of the Liberty Bell. So it kind of connected our countries that way. The other windows that I saw in Germany, some of the big cathedrals, they were mostly biblical windows. And again, a lot of them are on the parable of the prodigal son, or, Jesus turning the water into wine, those types of things. So they were similar, but different.
Any other questions?
Great.
So when one of these memorial windows, say in the south, it may be with Confederate flag imagery, is decommissioned, what is put in place?
So, well, two things. So I do talk in my dissertation about a denomination of civil religion, which I would argue is a Southern lost cause civil religion, but that's a whole different portion of my dissertation. In this Robert E. Lee, the church that contains Robert E. Lee, St. Paul, they went through this reconciliation process. They did not remove the windows, but I think the windows were kind of a bone of contention, and maybe why the minister that was responsible for having a lot of that iconography removed from the church, because this church is referred to as the Cathedral of the Confederacy, because at one point I think there were 14 different generals of the Confederacy that came to a church service. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, worshiped there, along with Robert E. Lee, and their pews that they sponsored with a subscription are kind of right next to each other. They went through this whole reconciliation process and took down a lot of the Confederate flags and images that they had, not necessarily in their stained glass windows, but in plaques all around the church. And I think those plaques and so forth are headed to a museum somewhere. But the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., that removed that whole bay, they call it the Lee Jackson Bay of Windows. One, it was sponsored by the Daughters of the Confederacy, which is kind of an interesting part to that story. But when they took the windows down, they too went through this reconciliation process, and I think those windows are likely headed to the Smithsonian. But they're collecting information from their visitors and from the people of the congregation as to what they would like to do, or they did ask what they would like to do, and they ended up commissioning an African-American stained glass artist who's doing kind of a contemporary abstract window to replace where they took out the Confederate symbols, and then they're gonna curate that new installation with how certainly as a congregation, they want to be accepting and inclusive of all different races and so it was quite a process that they went through. And there's some really interesting public dialogue that they have on YouTube videos that you could listen to if you were interested in that process that they went through.
Okay, one more round of applause for Sandy. So thank you all, and members of the committee, we will reconvene in about 10 minutes. How's that?
Can I say hi to Kenning? Good to see you again, Kenning.